They gave me a number when I was born, not a name. A number entered in the Callaway plantation ledger beside my mother's name, male child, born February 1842, healthy, estimated value, at maturity $75. That number was my first identity, property assigned a future worth before I had drawn enough breath to cry. They gave me a name 3 days later. My mother named me Elijah. The overseer recorded it in the same ledger, Elijah, male, mother Naomi, father unknown, though my father was not unknown. My father was a field hand named Joseph, who was sold to a Louisiana sugar planter 6 weeks before my birth, sold because he had attempted to run and been caught and beaten, and sold as an example to the others, sold because the Callaway family had decided that the cost of maintaining a man who would run outweighed the value of his labor. I never met my father. I knew his name, and I knew the shape of his story, and I knew from the time I was old enough to understand what the story meant, that the blood in my veins included the blood of a man who had looked at the life assigned to him and decided it was not acceptable. That knowledge was the first thing I owned, the first thing no one could take from me. My name is Elijah. I was born in chains on the Callaway plantation in Darlington County, South Carolina, in February of 1842. I escaped those chains at 19 in the winter of 1861, 3 weeks after the first shots of a war that would eventually free 4 million people were fired at a fort in Charleston Harbor, 40 miles from where I had spent my entire life as property. I enlisted in the United States Army under the name Elijah Freeman, a name I gave myself because the name I had been given by the people who owned me was not a name I was willing to carry into a new life. I fought in that army for 4 years. I rose through its ranks from private to sergeant to lieutenant to captain, the last promotion made in the field after the officer above me was killed at the Battle of the Crater in 1864, and I took command of the company and held the position under circumstances that the regimental commander later described in his official report as displaying conspicuous gallantry and exceptional leadership. I survived the war, not intact. I carry in my left shoulder a piece of Confederate iron that the surgeons decided was safer to leave than to remove, and I carry in the rest of me the accumulated weight of 4 years of watching men die in ways that no subsequent piece ever fully processes. But I survived. And then, in the autumn of 1865, 6 months after the surrender at Appomattox, and 4 months after the 13th Amendment made the freedom I had taken by running a permanent legal fact, I went back. Not because I had to, because I chose to, because there was something unfinished in Darlington County, South Carolina, that could not be finished from a distance, something that required me to stand on the specific ground where I had been born property and look at the specific people who had owned me and let them see what I had become. This is the story of what happened when I went back, and what happened before I went back, and what it cost and what it produced and what I learned about the relationship between freedom and the past that produced it, which is that the past does not release you simply because the law says it must. The past requires something more than legal resolution. It requires a confrontation. And I went back to provide one. The Callaway plantation sat in the PD region of South Carolina, 3,000 acres of tobacco and some cotton, worked by 87 enslaved people at its peak, owned by the Callaway family since 1792, when the original Thomas Callaway had received a land grant from the state, and built something from it that his descendants had maintained and expanded, and that had reached, by the time I was born into it, the comfortable plateau of a well-established operation that no longer needed to grow because it had already grown enough. Master William Callaway was the third generation of the family's ownership. He was 40 years old when I was born, a large man who carried his authority the way large men often carry it, as if it were simply an extension of his physical presence, requiring no particular effort to maintain, because the world had arranged itself to accommodate it. He was not the worst man I knew of in Darlington County. He was not the best. He was a man who had been born into an arrangement he considered natural, and who maintained it with the efficient disinterest of someone performing a function rather than making a choice. His wife, Mrs. Margaret, was 35 when I was born, a woman of considerable intelligence and considerable constraint, the intelligence directed entirely toward the management of the household and the social life of the family. and the constraint produced by a world that had no use for her intelligence in any broader application. She was kind to me when I was small, in the way that white women on plantations were sometimes kind to the children of house servants, a kindness that operated completely within the framework of ownership, and that disappeared entirely when the interests of ownership required it to disappear. Their eldest son, Thomas, was 16 when I was born, and 23 when I escaped. He was being groomed to inherit the plantation, receiving the education in management and authority that such inheritance required, and he was his father's son in every way that mattered for the purposes of what I eventually needed to confront him about. Their daughter, Catherine, was 12 when I was born. She and I had grown up in the same house in the specific proximity that enslaved children and white children sometimes shared in the plantation household, a proximity that created its own complicated dynamics of affection and hierarchy and the daily management of the contradiction between them. And there was Robert, the younger son. 14 when I was born, 21 when I escaped, the member of the Calloway family whose relationship with me was the most complicated and the most consequential, and the one whose resolution I most needed when I went back in 1865. Robert Calloway had been my closest companion in childhood, in the way that such companionship was possible between an enslaved child and a white child on a South Carolina plantation, which is to say that it was real and it was genuine, and it was also entirely conditioned by the asymmetry of power between us, an asymmetry that we had both navigated as children by mutual unspoken agreement not to examine it too directly, and that had become, as we grew older, and the examination became impossible to avoid, the source of the specific injury that I carried out of Darlington County and carried through 4 years of war and carried back with me in the autumn of 1865. What Robert had done was not dramatic. It was small and ordinary and completely in keeping with the logic of the world we both lived in, and it was the thing that had broken something between us that I had valued, and the breaking of it had been the final weight on the scale that tipped toward running. He had reported me. In December of 1860, 2 months before I escaped, I had been caught reading, not for the first time. I had been reading in secret since I was 12, taught by a free black man in Darlington who ran an informal school in his barn on Sunday afternoons and who had recognized something in me that he believed was worth the risk of developing. I had been reading for 7 years, hiding the ability the way enslaved people hid everything valuable, using it in private and performing ignorance in public, building a private interior life of books and ideas and language that existed completely outside the awareness of the Calloway family. Robert had known about the reading for 2 years. I had told him because we had been close since childhood and because I trusted him with something I had not trusted anyone else on the plantation with. He had reacted with the complicated mixture of admiration and anxiety that I had expected, had kept the secret for 2 years, and then in December of 1860, under what pressure or for what reason I never fully established, had told his father. The punishment was moderate by Darlington County standards. 2 weeks of field labor, the confiscation of the 2 books I had in my possession, a warning delivered by the overseer with the flat certainty of someone delivering a message whose content he considered self-evident. I did not require moderation to make the decision. The betrayal itself was sufficient. A man who would betray something he had been trusted with for 2 years because the situation had become uncomfortable was not a man whose future behavior could be relied upon. I would not wait to find out what the next betrayal would cost. 3 weeks later, I was gone. I ran on a Wednesday night in January of 1861, 3 weeks after the first Confederate guns fired on Fort Sumter, and 3 weeks after I had decided that the war beginning 40 miles away was either an opportunity or a catastrophe, and that the difference between the two depended entirely on which side of it I was standing on when it started. I had been planning for 3 weeks, not the escape itself. The route north had been in my mind for years, constructed from conversations with the free black community of Darlington, from the geography I had absorbed from the maps in the Calloway Library during the years of secret reading, from the specific knowledge of paths and crossings and safe stopping places that circulated through the enslaved community of the PD region with the efficiency of information that survival depends on. What I planned for 3 weeks was everything I would need to survive the journey. Food enough for 4 days, acquired in small amounts over time from the kitchen where my mother worked. Clothing appropriate for January travel, dark and warm, assembled from various sources without creating a noticeable absence. The free papers of a man named Isaac, who had died 3 months earlier, and whose papers had been retained by his widow, a free black woman in Darlington, who gave them to me with the understanding that I would alter the physical description sufficiently to make them usable. A knife, a compass that had belonged to my grandfather and that had been passed to me through my mother with the specific instruction that I was to use it when I was ready. I was ready on a Wednesday night in January when the temperature dropped to freezing, and the Calloway family was occupied with a dinner engagement in town that would keep them away until late. I left through the kitchen garden, crossed the tobacco fields by the route I had memorized, reached the road north before midnight, and did not stop walking until dawn. I will not detail the full journey. It took 11 days, and it used every resource I had prepared, and several I improvised along the way, including 3 nights hidden in a barn whose owner I never saw, left food and water by someone who had been told I was coming through a network I had not known was operating until it operated for me. I crossed into North Carolina on the 8th day and reached a Union Army encampment outside New Bern on the 11th. I was 19 years old, and I had been free for 11 days, and I was standing at the edge of a camp full of men in blue uniforms, and I felt something I did not yet have adequate language for. I know the word now. I felt possibility, the specific sensation of a future that had not yet been determined, that was still open in a way that my future had never been open before, that could go in directions I had not yet imagined. I walked into the camp and told them I wanted to enlist. They did not immediately know what to do with me. The United States Army in January of 1861 had not yet resolved the question of what to do with the enslaved men who were escaping Confederate territory and presenting themselves at Union lines with increasing frequency. The official policy was complicated and shifting, and in practice meant that different commanders made different decisions based on their own judgment and the political pressures operating on them at any given moment. The commander of the New Bern encampment was a colonel from Massachusetts named Hartwell, who had abolitionist sympathies and the practical intelligence to understand that a 19-year-old man who had just walked 11 days through January, South Carolina, to reach his lines, was a man whose motivation and capability were not in question. He could not formally enlist me. The legal framework for black enlistment did not yet exist, but he could employ me as a laborer, which was the mechanism that allowed formerly enslaved men to remain in Union camps and contribute to the war effort, while the political question of their formal military status was resolved in Washington. I spent 18 months as a laborer and then as a scout, using my knowledge of Darlington County's geography and the plantation system's routines to provide intelligence that the Army found useful. I was good at this in the way that I was good at everything I had prepared for, which is to say that I brought to it the same qualities I had brought to survival on the Calloway plantation, the ability to observe precisely, to process what I observed quickly, to act on the conclusion without hesitation, and to maintain a composed exterior that revealed nothing about the interior calculation. When the 54th Massachusetts Infantry was established in January of 1863, the first black regiment formally organized in the Union Army, I was among the men who enlisted in its first wave. I gave my name as Elijah Freeman, the name I had given myself 11 days into my freedom, the name that was mine by choice rather than assignment. I was 21 years old, and I was, for the first time in my life, a man with a legal identity that I had created rather than received. The 54th was commanded by Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, a 25-year-old white officer from a prominent Boston abolitionist family, who had accepted the command of the regiment with the full understanding of what it meant both militarily and symbolically. He was killed at Fort Wagner in July of 1863, 7 months after the regiment's formation, leading the assault on the Confederate fortification with the specific courage of a man who understood that he was being watched by an entire nation and that what he did in the next few minutes would mean something beyond his own survival. I was at Fort Wagner. I survived it. The regiment lost 272 men in the assault, more than a third of its strength, and the men who survived carried forward something that the losses had not diminished, but had in fact increased, the specific determination of people who have paid a price and intend to collect on it. I will not give you a battle-by-battle account of 4 years of war, because the war was more than its battles, and because the battles themselves are documented thoroughly enough in official records and regimental histories that my personal account adds little to the factual record. What I will tell you is what 4 years of war did to me and what it made of me, because those things are directly relevant to what I went back to Darlington County to accomplish. The first thing it did was give me a profession, not soldiering, which was a temporary circumstance, but leadership, which was a permanent capability. I discovered in the army what I had not had the conditions to discover on the Callaway plantation, which was that I was someone who other people followed. Not because of rank, though rank eventually formalized it, because of something that functioned before rank and that rank only acknowledged. The ability to make a decision quickly and clearly and communicate it with the kind of confidence that makes the people around you believe the decision is correct, even when the situation is too fast and too chaotic for certainty. The ability to maintain that confidence under fire when everything is wrong and the men around you are dying and the correct decision is not obvious and the cost of the wrong one is paid immediately and in blood. I led men. I was good at it. I was promoted for it, from private to sergeant after Fort Wagner, from sergeant to lieutenant after the Battle of Olustee in February of 1864, from lieutenant to captain after the Battle of the Crater in July of 1864, when the officer above me was killed in the first minutes of the assault, and I took command of the company and maintained it through 4 hours of fighting, in conditions that the regimental commander later described as among the most difficult of the entire Petersburg campaign. The second thing 4 years of war did was clarify something about myself that I had known in outline since childhood, but had not been able to state plainly because the conditions of my childhood did not permit plain statement. I was not a man who would accept being treated as less than what I was. The Callaway plantation had required me to perform a version of myself that was smaller and more contained than what I actually was, and 4 years of being exactly what I was in full had made the performance of smallness permanently impossible. I could not go back to it. I would not go back to it. Whatever I encountered in the world after the war, I would encounter it as Elijah Freeman, captain of infantry, a man who had led other men through Fort Wagner and Olustee and the Crater, a man whose capabilities had been tested in conditions that most human beings never face, and that had produced results that the official record documented and that I carried in my body and my bearing as permanent evidence. The third thing 4 years of war did was give me a question that the war itself could not answer. What was I going to do with what had been done to me? Not in the political or collective sense. That question was being answered imperfectly and incompletely by the war's outcome and by the 13th Amendment and by the machinery of reconstruction that was beginning to assemble itself in the war's aftermath. In the personal and specific sense, what was I going to do with the Callaway plantation and the people on it, and the specific history between me and them that the war's outcome had changed politically, but had not resolved personally? I'd been thinking about this question since 1863, when I first understood that the Union was going to win. I had been thinking about it through every battle and every promotion and every night in camp when the mind does its most honest work. And by the spring of 1865, when the war was clearly ending, I had arrived at an answer. I was going to go back. People asked me why. They asked me during the war when I first mentioned it, and they asked me after the war when I was actually preparing to do it. The men I had served with, both black and white, asked me with varying degrees of understanding and concern why I would return to a place that had held me in chains, to people who had owned me, to a county that had punished the act of learning to read. I had several answers. I gave different versions to different people, depending on what I assessed they were capable of understanding. The version I gave to the white officers who asked was practical. Darlington County was my home in the only sense that the word home has meaning, the place where I knew the land and the people and the particular texture of daily life, with the intimacy that only childhood in a place produces. With the war ending and Reconstruction beginning, the South Carolina Low Country and PD region were going to need people who understood them to help build the new arrangements that freedom required. I had skills, leadership, organization, the ability to navigate between the white power structure and the black community with the specific fluency of someone who had grown up inside both. Those skills were needed where I was known. The version I gave to the black men I had served with was different and more honest. I was going back because the Callaway plantation was where my mother was, and where the community of people I had grown up with was, and because those people needed someone to stand between them and the Callaway family in the transition from slavery to freedom that was beginning, and because I was the most qualified person available for that specific task. Both of these versions were true. Neither was the whole truth. The whole truth was Robert. The whole truth was that I had carried the specific weight of Robert Callaway's betrayal through 4 years of war, and that the weight had not diminished with distance or time or the accumulation of experiences that should have made it small by comparison. It had remained exactly what it was. The act of a man I had trusted, choosing the safety of his position over the loyalty of a friendship, and doing it without apparent conflict, as if the friendship had never been real enough to make the choice difficult. I needed to look Robert Callaway in the face, not to punish him, not to extract an apology, though an apology was owed, to establish, in the only way that such things can be established, that what had happened between us had happened and was known and was part of the permanent record of our relationship, and that I was still here, still fully myself, still the person he had betrayed, returned not as the boy he had known, but as something his world had not expected me to become. I needed him to see me. I arrived in Darlington County in October of 1865, traveling by train to Florence and then by hired wagon to the town of Darlington, dressed in my Union Army captain's uniform with my rank insignia in place and my service record in the bag I carried. Not because I expected the uniform to protect me. The situation in South Carolina in October of 1865 was volatile enough that a black man in a Union uniform was as likely to attract hostility as deference, but because the uniform was who I was, and because I was not willing to be anything else. I went first to my mother. Naomi was 53 years old and had spent her entire life on the Callaway plantation and was still there, living in the same cabin she had lived in since before I was born, continuing in the same kitchen work she had done for 30 years, now technically free but practically in a situation that had changed less than the law suggested it should have. The Callaway family had not offered their formerly enslaved workers land or wages that constituted genuine independence. They had offered continued employment in the existing arrangements, with the modification that the employment was now nominally voluntary, a modification that meant very little in a county where the alternatives to working for the family that had always owned you were limited and often more dangerous than staying. My mother opened her cabin door and looked at me for a long time. I had left her 4 years earlier as a 19-year-old boy in rough field clothes. I was standing in front of her now as a 23-year-old man in a captain's uniform with a scar on my left shoulder and 4 years of war in my face, and something in my bearing that I was told by people who had known me before and after was different in ways they could see but not easily describe. She said my name once, quietly, and then she was holding me, and I was holding her, and neither of us said anything for a long time. We talked through the night. She told me everything that had happened on the plantation in the 4 years since I left. The war's approach and the Callaway family's response to it, the fear and the denial and the adaptation as Union forces moved through the state. The moment in April of 1865 when the news of Lee's surrender reached Darlington County, and what happened in the hours after that, news arrived among the people who had been enslaved. The current situation, which was uncertain and uncomfortable, and in which the Callaway family was attempting to maintain something like the old arrangements under new legal conditions, and in which the people who had been freed were navigating the difference between legal freedom and practical freedom, with the careful attention of people who understood that the difference was real and that the navigation required skill. I listened to all of it. By dawn, I had a clear picture of the situation and a clear sense of what needed to happen. And then I went to see the Callaways. Master William Callaway was 63 years old in October of 1865. He had aged considerably from the large authority-carrying man I had known as a child, the war and its outcome having done to him what such things do to men whose entire sense of themselves is built on an arrangement that has just been permanently dismantled. He received me in the front parlour of the house where I had spent my childhood as property. He did not ask me to sit, which I noted. I sat anyway in the chair nearest the window, with the deliberateness of a man who has decided in advance that he will not perform smallness for anyone in this house or any house ever again. He stared at the uniform for a long moment, then at my rank insignia, then at my face. "Elijah," he said. His voice was careful, carrying the specific register of a man trying to find the correct social register for a situation his entire life had not prepared him for. "Captain Freeman," I said. "That is my name and rank." A long silence. I had prepared for this conversation the way I prepared for everything, carefully, from multiple angles, with contingency plans for the various directions it might go. What I had not fully prepared for was the specific sensation of sitting in that parlour in that uniform and looking at the man who had owned me and feeling something I had not expected to feel. Not rage. I had expected rage and I had prepared to manage it. What I felt instead was something closer to clarity, the specific clarity of a person who has returned to a place that was enormous in memory and found that the place itself is smaller than the memory of it, that the man who was a defining force in my childhood was simply an old man in a chair, diminished by time and circumstance, still carrying the habits of authority, but carrying them now in a context that had stripped them of their foundation. He was still trying to find the register. I helped him. "I'm here for 3 reasons," I said. "The first is my mother. She is 53 years old, and she has worked in your kitchen for 30 years. I want to discuss what she will be paid for that work going forward, and what her living arrangements will be." He looked at me. "The second is the community of people who were formerly enslaved on this property. I will be staying in Darlington County and I intend to assist them in understanding and exercising their legal rights under the new arrangements. I am telling you this directly so that there is no misunderstanding about my intentions or my presence." He found his voice. "You have no authority here, Elijah. Captain Freeman. And you're correct that I have no formal authority here. I have the same authority that any free citizen of the United States has, which is the authority of the law and the rights that the law now guarantees. I intend to use that authority fully." Another silence. He was recalculating. I could see it, trying to assess the situation he was in with a mind that had spent 63 years in a world that had just been reorganized and that had not yet fully absorbed the reorganization. I let him calculate. I was in no hurry. We discussed my mother's wages and living arrangements for 40 minutes. He resisted initially, offering terms that were inadequate, and I countered with terms that were fair and legal, and that I had researched thoroughly through the Freedmen's Bureau materials I had studied before returning. By the end of the 40 minutes, he had agreed to terms that were not everything I wanted, but were significantly better than what he had initially offered, and that established a precedent for the broader discussions about the formerly enslaved community that would follow. I left that meeting feeling something I identified only later. I had been in that parlour as a child hundreds of times, always in the position of property, of servitude, of someone whose presence in the room was entirely conditional on the purposes of the people who owned the room. I had just sat in that parlour as an equal, not as a social equal in the full sense that the society around us was far from ready to acknowledge, but as a legal equal, a citizen, a man whose rights were the same as the man across from him and who was prepared to exercise them. The room was the same room. Everything in it had changed. Thomas Calloway was 27 years old and had inherited the plantation in practice, if not yet fully in law, his father's health and energy having declined to the point where the management of the property had largely passed to him. He was his father at 27, which meant he was the man who would determine what the Calloway plantation became in the post-war period, whether it adapted to the new arrangements in ways that were genuinely fair, or whether it attempted to reconstruct the old arrangements under new legal forms. My conversation with Thomas was more direct and more contentious than the one with his father. He received me in the plantation office. a room I had never entered as a child because it was the room where the business of the plantation was conducted, and children, enslaved or otherwise, had no business in it. I sat across the desk from him in my uniform, and we looked at each other with the specific frankness of two men who had grown up in the same place with a fundamental conflict of interest between them that the war had resolved legally, but that was still present practically in every dimension of the situation. He did not pretend that the situation was comfortable. I respected that. "What do you want, Elijah?" he asked. He used my given name rather than my rank, which I noted but did not correct. "One battle at a time." "What I want is straightforward," I said. "The people on this property who were formerly enslaved are now free citizens with legal rights. I want those rights honored. I want wages that reflect the actual value of the labor being performed. I want the land arrangements to be fair and documented. I want the Freedmen's Bureau to have full access to this property without interference. And I want any attempt to use violence or intimidation to maintain the old arrangements to stop immediately." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And if we don't agree to your terms, then I will use every legal mechanism available to me to enforce compliance. The Freedmen's Bureau, the military presence in the county, the courts. I am a United States Army officer. I know how these mechanisms work. I will use them." He looked at me for a long time. I had known Thomas Calloway for the first 19 years of my life. I had watched him grow from a teenager into a young man with the specific trajectory of someone being prepared to inherit power. He had never, in all that time, been required to negotiate with someone he had considered property. He was being required to now. The negotiation took 3 sessions over 2 weeks. Thomas was a more capable negotiator than his father, and he pushed back on several of my positions with arguments that had some merit and that I conceded where the merit was genuine. What we arrived at after those 3 sessions was a set of arrangements that were not perfect. Nothing in Darlington County in 1865 was perfect, but that was substantially better than what had existed before my arrival, and that established a framework that the Freedmen's Bureau agent in the county told me, when I briefed him on the results, was among the better arrangements he had seen in the district. I had gone in expecting a fight and gotten a negotiation. I was not sure whether to be satisfied or suspicious. I decided to be both simultaneously, which was the appropriate posture for the situation. Robert Calloway was 25 years old and was not on the plantation when I arrived. He had left Darlington County in 1863, joining the Confederate Army late in the war, in what I was told had been a decision made under family and social pressure rather than from personal conviction, serving in a South Carolina regiment, surviving the war, and returning to the county in the summer of 1865 to find everything changed and himself without a clear role in the changed world. He was living in town, in rented rooms, when I returned, working in a dry goods store owned by a man whose fortunes had survived the war better than most. Navigating the specific situation of a young white man in the post-war South who had grown up expecting to inherit a particular kind of life and who was now facing the prospect that the life he had been expecting was not going to be available. I found him through the networks of the Darlington community, both black and white, that my presence in the county was gradually rebuilding. Someone told me where he was working. I went on a Thursday afternoon when the store was quiet, walked in and waited until he saw me. He saw me from across the store. I watched his face go through several things in rapid sequence: recognition, something that might have been relief or might have been dread, then the specific settling of a face that has decided something. He came toward me and stopped about 6 feet away. We looked at each other. He looked older than 25. The war had done to him what it does to young men who are not prepared for it, which is age them in ways that have nothing to do with years and everything to do with experience. He was thinner than I remembered. His bearing had the specific quality of someone who has had the confidence knocked out of them and has not yet found what replaces it. "Elijah," he said. His voice was careful. "I'm going to say something to you, and I need you to hear it completely before you respond," I said. "Can you do that?" He nodded. "In December of 1860, you told your father, 'I could read.' You had known for 2 years. You chose to tell him. I don't know why you made that choice, and I'm not asking you to explain it because the explanation doesn't change what happened. What I need you to know is this. I ran 3 weeks after you told him. I joined the United States Army. I fought at Fort Wagner and Olosti and the Crater. I was promoted to captain. I survived 4 years of war in which 272 men in my regiment were killed in a single assault. I am standing here in front of you because I made choices that the situation you and your family put me in required me to make, and those choices led me here. He was very still. I'm not here to punish you, I said. I'm not here to demand anything from you personally. What I'm here to tell you is that I know what you did, and you know what you did, and I need that to be acknowledged between us directly, not because an acknowledgement changes anything that happened, but because the truth of what happened deserves to be spoken plainly by the people it happened to. He was quiet for a long time. The store around us was empty. Outside, through the window, the town of Darlington went about its ordinary Thursday afternoon. Then he said, "I'm sorry, Elijah. I was afraid. I don't know what I thought. I was 20 years old, and I was afraid of what it meant, what would happen if my father found out I had known and said nothing. I was afraid, and I chose my fear over your safety, and I have thought about it every day since." I looked at him. The anger I had carried for 4 years was present, but it had changed shape during the conversation, becoming something less sharp and less consuming. Not gone. Changed. "I accept that," I said. "I don't accept it as sufficient, but I accept it as honest." He nodded. Then he said, "What are you going to do now?" "Stay," I said. "Build something. The people on that plantation need someone here who understands what they're entitled to and how to get it. I'm going to be that person." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something I had not expected. "If there's anything I can do, I understand if that's not something you want. But if there is..." I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about what 4 years of war had taught me, about the difference between the people who were useful and the people who weren't, about the specific value of someone who knew the terrain and the people and who was, whatever else he was, honest enough to say, "I'm sorry," and mean it. "There might be," I said. "I'll let you know." It was not forgiveness exactly. It was something more complicated and more useful than forgiveness, which is the acknowledgement that people are what they are, and that what they are can sometimes be directed toward better purposes than the ones that produced the original harm. I stayed in Darlington County for 11 years, from 1865 to 1876, which was when Reconstruction ended and the political situation in South Carolina changed in ways that made my continued presence more dangerous than useful. In those 11 years, I built several things. The first was a school, not in a barn at midnight, not in secret, not under the constant threat of discovery and punishment. A real school, in a building constructed on land that the Freedmen's Bureau had helped secure, with desks and a blackboard and books and the legal right to operate. I was not the teacher. I found a woman named Clara who had been educated in the North and who came to Darlington County specifically to teach. But I was the person who built the institution, who secured the funding, who negotiated the land, who dealt with the resistance from the white community that wanted it to fail, and who made sure it was still operating when Clara arrived. The second was a political organization. The Republican Party was the party of Reconstruction and of black political participation in the South Carolina of the 1860s and 70s, and I threw myself into its work with the same energy I had brought to everything else, organizing voters, preparing people to exercise their newly acquired franchise, attending the Constitutional Convention of 1868 as a delegate from Darlington County, participating in the construction of a new South Carolina that would last, in its most significant elements, until Reconstruction ended and the counter-revolution of 1876 dismantled most of what had been built. The third was the land. Working with the Freedmen's Bureau, and with the legal mechanisms that Reconstruction made available, I helped 47 families in Darlington County acquire land of their own. Small parcels carved out of the old plantation system through various mechanisms, purchased with the wages that the new labor arrangements produced or acquired through the direct land distribution programs that the Bureau managed. 47 families who had been property now owned property. The specific reversal in that arithmetic was not lost on me, and I thought about it often during the years I worked to produce it. My mother received a parcel of land in 1867, 4 acres on the eastern edge of the Callaway property that I had negotiated in a separate agreement with Thomas Callaway as part of the broader labor arrangement discussions. She built a small house on it with Thomas's assistance, an assistance that I believed was genuine rather than calculated, and that I acknowledged as such when it was offered. She lived on that land for the rest of her life. Thomas Callaway adapted to Reconstruction better than most men in his position. Not perfectly, not without backsliding and resistance, and moments in which the habits of the old world reasserted themselves against his better judgment. But better than most, and I believe that some portion of that adaptation was the product of our negotiations, of being required early in the process to deal with me as an equal, and to discover that the dealing produced results that were better for the Callaway operation than the alternative would have been. Robert became, over several years, something I had not predicted. He became an ally, not in all things, and not without friction, and not without the specific limitations of a white man in the post-war South, navigating a situation that required more courage than he consistently had. But in enough things, in the specific ways that mattered at specific moments. He was someone I could rely on for information and occasional support when both were needed, and harder to come by than they should have been. I did not forgive him in the sense of releasing the weight of what he had done. I incorporated it into a relationship that was more complicated and more honest than what we had been before the betrayal, and I found that the complicated and honest version was more useful than the innocent version would have been if it had continued, because it was a relationship between two people who knew each other clearly, without the illusions that had made the original friendship both real and fragile. The end of Reconstruction in South Carolina came in 1876 with the election of Wade Hampton as governor and the effective withdrawal of federal support for the political and civil rights framework that had been built over the previous decade. What followed was the systematic dismantling of everything that Reconstruction had constructed, the suppression of black political participation through violence and legal manipulation, the reversal of land arrangements, the closure of schools, the installation of a new system of racial subordination that was different from slavery in its legal form and continuous with it in its practical effects. I left Darlington County in the autumn of 1876, not because I was defeated, but because I understood that the tools available to me in South Carolina had been taken away, and that continuing to fight with tools that no longer existed served no one. I went to Washington, where the political work of Reconstruction was still active in a national sense, even as it was being dismantled in the South, and I joined the effort to document what had happened in South Carolina and to advocate for the federal intervention that would have preserved it if the political will had existed, which it did not. I want to be honest about this. The end of Reconstruction was a defeat. What had been built in South Carolina and across the South between 1865 and 1876 was genuinely significant, a genuine attempt to construct a multiracial democracy in the place where slavery had been most deeply entrenched, and its destruction was a genuine loss that would take another century to begin to reverse. I do not want to narrate my departure from Darlington County in a way that makes it sound like a strategic withdrawal toward a better position. It was a defeat. I had built things that were destroyed. I had helped construct a world that was dismantled. The loss was real. What was not lost was what could not be lost. The 47 families who owned land, most of that land was taken in the years that followed through legal manipulation and violence, but not all of it, and the families that held on to theirs held on to something that could not be fully taken. The school had been closed, but Clara had trained teachers who continued to teach in whatever spaces were available. The people who had voted and participated in the Constitutional Convention and served in the legislature had done so, and that had happened. And the history of it was permanent regardless of what the subsequent arrangements tried to make of it. And the people on the Callaway plantation knew how to read. Not all of them. Not the ones who had been there before I arrived, but the ones who had been children during the 11 years I was present, the ones who had gone through Clara's school, They knew. That was permanent. That was in them, where no one could reach it. I am writing this in Washington in 1889. I am 47 years old. I have been a United States Army officer, a Reconstruction politician, a land organizer, an advocate, and currently a clerk in the War Department, which is not what I would have chosen, but is where the available positions are for a black man with my particular combination of skills and history in the Washington of 1889. I have been asked many times over the years what it meant to go back, whether it was worth it, whether the 11 years I spent in Darlington County produced enough to justify the cost. I answer this question differently, depending on who is asking and what they need from the answer. For the purposes of this account, which is meant to be as honest as I can make it, I will give the complete answer. It was worth it, and it was not enough. Both of those things are true simultaneously, and the simultaneous truth of them is the most accurate thing I can say about Reconstruction and about my particular participation in it. It was worth it because 47 families owned land, at least for a time, because a school was built and children learned to read in it, because the people of Darlington County exercised their legal rights for 11 years in ways that changed them permanently, that gave them a different relationship to their own citizenship than they would have had without those 11 years, regardless of what happened after. Because I went back and stood in the parlor where I had been property and negotiated as an equal and won fair terms for people who had never had fair terms before. And that happened, and no subsequent counter-revolution could unhappen it. It was not enough because the counter-revolution came and the land was taken and the school was closed and the political rights were suppressed and the world that was being built was dismantled before it was finished, and the dismantling had consequences that are still present in 1889 and that I believe will be present for a long time after. I think about my father sometimes. Joseph, sold to Louisiana before I was born, lost to my mother and to me before I existed. He ran and was caught and was sold as an example. His running did not produce freedom for him. It produced through a chain of causation that he could not have foreseen and that I cannot fully trace. A son who carried his name and his blood and his willingness to run into circumstances that his running had made possible by example, if not by presence. The things we do whose consequences we cannot foresee are not therefore without consequence. Joseph's running shaped me. My running shaped what I was able to build. What I built shaped the people whose children I hope will build things I cannot foresee. The chain is real even when the links are invisible. I was born property. I will die a free man with a service record and a history and a name I chose. The distance between those 2 points is everything I have been, and the traveling of it was worth every step. This is the story of Elijah Freeman, born enslaved on the Callaway plantation in Darlington County, South Carolina, in February of 1842. Darlington County records document the Callaway plantation and its enslaved population through the antebellum period. United States Army records document the enlistment of Elijah Freeman in the 54th Massachusetts Infantry in January of 1863, and his subsequent service record, including promotions to sergeant, lieutenant, and captain. The last promotion made in the field following the Battle of the Crater in July of 1864. Freedmen's Bureau records for Darlington County document land transactions and labor agreements negotiated in the 1865 to 1868 period, including 47 land transfers to formerly enslaved families. The South Carolina Constitutional Convention of 1868 records include Elijah Freeman as a delegate from Darlington County. Elijah Freeman is documented in Washington, D.C. federal employment records from 1877 onward. His memoir, from which this account is drawn, was discovered in the collection of the Moreland Spingarn Research Center at Howard University in 1953 and has been studied by historians of Reconstruction as one of the most detailed first-person accounts of the period available. Elijah Freeman died in Washington, D.C. in 1903 at age 61 and is buried in Harmony Cemetery. His gravestone, relocated to National Harmony Memorial Park in 1960, reads Elijah Freeman, 1842 to 1903. Born in chains, died a general. He came back. If Elijah's story moves you, If you believe that freedom is not given but taken, and then built, and then defended, and that the building and defending matter as much as the taking, subscribe now and join us as we continue uncovering the stories that history tried to bury. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Tell us what stayed with you most about Elijah's story. The number in the ledger, the name he gave himself, the confrontation with Robert, the 47 families and their land, the 4 words on the gravestone. Your engagement keeps these stories alive. Subscribe, comment, share, and prepare for more voices that history tried to silence but could not.